He's America's new top diplomat, Antony Blinken, and he's been in foreign policy circles in Washington for decades. Now he's stepping into the role of Secretary of State in these most challenging of times. The last 4 years with Donald Trump in charge, it's been all about America first. But what will the United States stand for in the world with Joe Biden as president? A familiar face in the diplomatic world, Antony Blinken has had a front row seat to history over the past 30 years. Secretary Blinken started his career in the White House, advising President Clinton in senior positions on the National Security Council. He was also senior advisor to President Obama in his roles on the NSC and as Deputy Secretary of State. As National Security Advisor to then Vice President Biden, he was in the Situation Room during the raid which killed Osama bin Laden.
It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here today.
Arguably, not since James Baker under the first President Bush has a Secretary of State entered office with so close a relationship with the President. There are many challenges ahead, not least leading the foreign interests of a deeply polarized country during a global pandemic. There's also the issue of troop withdrawal in Afghanistan, America's complicated relationship with China, and as ever, navigating the shape-shifting narrative between Washington and Moscow. It's a diplomatic intrigue that's not for the faint-hearted. Secretary Blinken, welcome to BBC News. You've just joined President Biden at the virtual G7 meeting, and of course there's been the Munich Security Conference. What is America's message to friends, allies and adversaries?
Well, I think you heard the president say it. America's back. It's interesting. He last spoke at the Munich Security Conference 2 years ago in 2019 as a professor. And he said America would be back, and now he's president, and America is back. But what does that mean? It means that we're determined once again to engage in the world, to show up again, because in the absence of American engagement, in the absence of American leadership, then one of two things happens: either some other country tries to take our place, and probably does so in a way that doesn't advance the common interests and values of the democratic world, or no one does. And then you may well have a vacuum and chaos that fills it before anything good does. But it's also imperative that American engagement and American leadership be for the purpose of finding new ways to cooperate among countries, because every single one of the major challenges we face, Yalda, the ones that affect the lives of our citizens, whether it's climate change, whether it's this pandemic, whether it's the spread of a dangerous weapon, not a single nation acting alone can deal with them effectively. We have to find ways to work together.
Well, top of the agenda at the G7, Secretary, is the global vaccination effort. President Biden has, of course, pledged $4 billion to COVAX. But what about allocating actual vaccines as a matter of urgency?
We're determined to be a responsible international actor, an international leader on vaccinations. And I think you're going to see the G7 and other countries working closely together to make sure that not only are our own populations vaccinated, but that the entire world is. Because here's the challenge we face. Unless and until everyone in the world is vaccinated, then no one is really fully safe. Because if the virus is out there and continuing to proliferate, it's also going to be mutating. And if it's mutating, it's going to come back and bite people everywhere. So we have a strong incentive to try to work together to make sure that vaccines are getting out there as best we can everywhere. And that's what some of these facilities are designed to do, whether it's through the COVID program, through COVAX, through the work that we'll be doing through the G7.
Well, President Macron has said 5% urgently. Is that something you're going to consider?
I think Boris Johnson, who is leading the effort today to bring the G7 together, has said that we'll look at all of these proposals to see how ultimately we can be effective in making sure that vaccines get out to the world. We're focused, of course, on making sure in the United States that people here are vaccinated. We've made major progress in the last few weeks in doing that, but we still have a long ways to go.
There is, of course, concern that Russia and China are filling that gap, and some are calling it a war of influence. Is the COVID vaccination a theatre of rivalry with Russia and China?
Well, we're certainly seeing countries engage in so-called vaccine diplomacy. Look, on one level, the single most important thing for all of us as human beings is to make sure that vaccines are out there, that they're safe, that they're effective, that they're distributed, and ultimately shots wind up in arms and people are safe. And of course, we're in a bit of a race precisely because of these mutations. With regard to China, one of the most important things going forward is that we get full transparency, full information sharing, a full understanding of how this virus emerged in the first place, for purposes of making sure that we can prevent the next one from hitting us. We've seen the devastating impact that COVID has had. We don't need this to be repeated. And the way we prevent it from being repeated is to make sure we have a better overall global health security system in place to spot pandemics before they fully emerge and to take the necessary steps. And that requires a few things. It requires countries to be transparent. It requires them to share information. It requires them to give access to international experts at the beginning of an outbreak, things that unfortunately we haven't seen from China. My hope is, going forward, that China becomes a full participant in these efforts to make sure that we can prevent the next pandemic, even as we're dealing with the current one.
Last week, the BBC World News was banned in China for our reports on the sexual abuse of Uyghur women in the re-education camps. You said that you plan on holding Beijing accountable for its abuses, but we've obviously heard that from other administrations. What will that actually look like in practice in your State Department?
Well, first, with regard to the BBC, we very much condemn the action that China took. And it is a striking thing to see China have one of the least open information spaces in the world. And yet, of course, it takes advantage of the fact that many of our countries have fully free and open information spaces. And China uses that to spread misinformation and propaganda. That lack of reciprocity, I think, ultimately is unsustainable. And it requires countries coming together to stand up for a free and open information space. And we're looking at ways to do that more effectively.
You've also said that you consider what's happening to the Uyghurs as genocide. Some are saying in light of this that there should be a boycott of the Winter Olympic Games. Is this something that you're considering?
You know, across all of these issues, we will be consulting very closely with our partners, with our fellow democracies, and of course here at home, with our Congress and other interested stakeholders. We'll come to that question at the appropriate time, but the main thing is, across all of these issues, it's really important that we consult closely and we work closely together.
Let's discuss Iran, Mr. Secretary. You've been speaking to European foreign ministers on rejoining the Iran nuclear deal. Can you clarify what has been agreed with your European partners?
Well, I think what's striking about the conversations with our European partners is that we're once again on the same page. We're not working at cross purposes. And that in and of itself is very important. We share the same objectives. President Biden has been clear for some time that if Iran returns to compliance with its obligations under the nuclear agreement, the United States would do the same thing. But then we would work with our partners both to lengthen and strengthen the agreement and to confront other issues, other challenges posed by Iran, including its destabilizing activities in the region, its ballistic missile programs, that need to be addressed. And what I found from my conversations with the European Three, as they're called, is that we're exactly on the same page. We now have an invitation from the European Union to have an informal meeting of the so-called Joint Commission of the Iran nuclear agreement. So the United States, the European partners, Russia, China, and Iran have all been invited, and we intend to be there. That, if it happens, would be the opening steps on a diplomatic path to seeing if we can resolve this issue.
The New York Times is reporting that you're taking limited steps to let up pressure on Iran to get them to the table. How do you respond to criticism that these are upfront concessions?
There are no upfront concessions. What we have is this. We have a policy in recent years of so-called maximum pressure on Iran that has not produced results. In fact, the problem has gotten worse. Iran is now much closer to being able to produce on short order enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon. That so-called breakout time had been pushed past 1 year by the nuclear agreement. It's now down, based on published reports, to just a few months. And meanwhile, Iran has been not standing down, but acting up in the region with various destabilizing actions, attacks on our own forces in Iraq and elsewhere, on our partners. And so the problem has gotten worse, not better. And President Biden believes strongly that strong, principled diplomacy is the best way to try to deal with these issues, to put the nuclear problem back in the box and to push back on Iran and other areas.
But I suppose the question is, why will Iran agree to more restrictions after you've given up your leverage?
Oh, we haven't given up our leverage at all. As you know, all of the sanctions remain in place. In fact, our leverage has now increased because we're now, once again, on the same page with our European partners. Because they very much disagreed with the United States pulling out of the nuclear agreement, they were expending most of their energy on trying to keep the agreement alive, not in exerting pressure on Iran for some of the other egregious actions that it takes in the region and beyond. We're now all in the same place, and we're united in purpose, and that's a very powerful thing.
You spoke to President Ghani this week and reiterated America's commitment to the peace process. The US Treasury Department said last month that al-Qaeda influence is growing in Afghanistan under the protection of the Taliban. Isn't this just a clear breach of the Doha Agreement?
Yaldi, we're in the midst of a very rigorous review of the policy toward Afghanistan, and in particular, we needed to review carefully the agreements that have been reached between the United States and the Taliban, and then the work that we had done with the government of Afghanistan. And all of that work is ongoing. But what we do know already, and the initial conclusion we've come to, is that it's vitally important for us and others to press the parties to make good on the commitments that they've already made. And when it comes to the Taliban, they've made clear commitments to disassociate themselves from al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, to not support them in any way, as well as to engage meaningfully. But the Treasury is
saying that they continue to allow al-Qaeda and protect them to remain in the country.
Well, we're taking a very hard look at that right now. And as I said, I think the most effective thing, necessary thing that we can do now, along with partners in the region, including neighbors, is to press the parties, starting with the Taliban, to make good on commitments that they've made, including the commitments they've made under the U.S.-Taliban agreement.
The administration has called on the military in Myanmar to immediately restore power to the democratically elected government. The administration has also imposed sanctions, but the generals just don't seem to be listening. Has American influence in Myanmar waned to the point where no matter what you say or do, it's unlikely to make a difference?
That coup triggered sanctions from the United States, very targeted and focused on the perpetrators of the coup and companies that support them. We've been working overtime to work with other countries to condemn the actions of the military, to call on it to restore power to the democratically elected government, to release political prisoners from jail, and certainly not to use violence against those standing up for their democratic rights. And we'll see where that goes. But pressure takes time to be felt, to be exerted. And my hope is that as more and more countries come together in making clear that this is not acceptable, we will see a change from the military. But the hard reality is that democratic transition has been interrupted against the will of the people of Myanmar, and the international community needs to speak clearly with one voice that that's not acceptable.
Mr. Secretary, we know that the world is a complex place, but often it's a simple phrase that sums up a strategy. So whether that's containment, the war on terror, or America first. So I suppose my question is, what is your foreign policy bumper sticker? What are the words we should think of when it comes to American foreign policy under President Biden?
Well, I don't think there's a simple bumper sticker. To some extent, Yalda, the problems are too complex to be summarized or simplified in a slogan. Having said that, look, I think the president believes in a few very fundamental principles, and maybe you can't confine them to a bumper sticker, but it is American engagement and American leadership. It is cooperation, and it is democracy at the foundation of our own country and of the partnerships that we have around the world. And when you put those things together, American engagement and leadership, trying to build stronger cooperation to tackle the issues that actually affect our people's lives, and working closely with fellow democracies, I think you have the makings of an effective foreign policy.
Secretary Blinken, thank you so much for your time.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Yalda.